The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a sound Ashley Cooper had learned to ignore 18 months ago. She clocked in at 10:16 p.m., her name appearing on the electronic system in clinical blue letters, and the night shift at Oak Creek Memorial began like every other night, unremarkable, predictable, safe. That was the point. That had always been the point. The hospital corridors smelled like antiseptic layered over stale coffee, a combination she'd come to find almost comforting. It meant order. It meant systems that worked. It meant no one would ask questions about the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, hidden between the fabric layers where only she could feel it against her ribs when she moved. The patch was from 2019. The world had moved on. She intended to stay here, in this quiet corner of Savannah, where the worst trauma was something that could be sutured or set or sedated. She changed into her scrubs in the locker room, navy blue, fitted, professional, and caught her reflection in the mirror above the sinks. 38 years old. Brown hair pulled back in a braid that had taken her 3 minutes to weave this morning while standing in her apartment kitchen with cold coffee in a mug from the hospital gift shop. Her hands were steady. They had been steady for 6 months now, ever since the nightmares stopped waking her at 3:13 a.m. with her heart rate climbing toward 180. The trembling had taken longer to fade. For 4 months she'd had to grip things twice as hard to hide it, railings, charts, syringes, but that had passed too. The night shift roster was posted on the board outside the nursing station. Trauma, cardiac, surgical. Standard Tuesday night. Ashley grabbed her tablet and checked patient census, 14 beds, 6 occupied, 2 admissions expected. She was walking toward the first room when Dr. Sterling arrived, moving through the sliding doors of the ER like a man who owned the building. He was tall, expensive-looking in a way that had nothing to do with his actual salary. His watch was a Rolex. She'd noted that on her first day, not because she cared about watches but because precision details were a habit she couldn't break. His scrubs were monogrammed. DSG. David Sterling Grant. He'd corrected someone's pronunciation of his last name during her interview, as if it needed defending, as if it wasn't obvious that his family had money the way some people had eyes. Sterling stopped at the nursing station and looked around the room. 3 nurses present. A phlebotomist. A resident from internal medicine. He smiled, and the smile was the kind that came with an agenda. Night shift, he announced, his voice carrying the particular cadence of someone accustomed to being heard. I've got a small wager I'd like to propose. There's a new nurse tonight. Ashley Cooper. I'm betting she doesn't make it past 1 week. The stress alone will send her running back to whatever smaller hospital she came from. Anyone want to take that bet? The room didn't go silent. People had learned not to react to Sterling. But Ashley felt the shift in the air, the collective intake of breath that nobody quite released. The phlebotomist looked at his shoes. The resident suddenly became very interested in a laptop screen. Ashley was at the medication cart, cross-checking her patient list. She didn't turn around. She simply continued her work, moving through the motions with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory layered over years of repetition. 1 measured breath in. 1 measured breath out. She'd absorbed worse than this. The first patient was Mr. Hernandez, 72, post-operative day 3 from a cholecystectomy. She checked his vitals, reviewed his chart, and adjusted his for rate without comment. Sterling was watching her from the nursing station. She could feel his attention the way you could feel someone standing too close in an elevator. It was a test. Everything with Sterling was a test. By 11:23 p.m., the trauma bay alerts began. A surgeon from Atlanta was visiting, someone Sterling had mentioned during her orientation with the kind of forced casualness that meant the man had status. The visiting trauma surgeon's name was Dr. Mercer, and he had the hands of someone who'd spent a decade operating in places where the equipment was improvised and the light came from headlamps. He was reviewing a case file when Ashley assisted with a surgical consult on a patient with acute bleeding from a duodenal ulcer. The attending surgeon called for a surgical tie-off, a specific suturing technique used when conventional methods failed. The bleeder was posterior wall, difficult angle, no margin for error. Ashley had the sutures ready before he asked. She'd threaded them 5,000 times. Maybe more. The count had stopped mattering around deployment 3. She moved to assist, her hands positioning the suture, her eyes locked on the surgical field. The surgeon made the tie-off with her guidance. Clean. Efficient. The kind of procedure that shouldn't work but did when someone knew exactly how to thread the angle. The bleeding stopped. The surgeon nodded once and continued with closure. Dr. Mercer watched the entire procedure from the observation window. When Ashley finished and stepped back, pulling off her gloves with that sharp snapping sound of latex separating from skin, he was waiting in the hallway outside the OR. "That stitch," he said. His voice was quiet, almost conversational. "The angle you used for the tie-off. That's a field hospital technique. Second and third intercostal approach for posterior wall bleeders. You learned that under pressure." Ashley continued walking toward the supply room. Mercer fell into step beside her. "I used that same stitch in Kandahar," he said. 2017, Trauma Hospital, FOB Shank. Lost the power twice during a surgery. This exact technique is how we stopped a femoral bleed when the equipment failed. You don't learn that in nursing school." She didn't answer. She placed the used gloves in the biohazard bin and turned to face him. Her eyes were level with his. She was tall, and he'd been made shorter by something she recognized in the way he held his shoulders. They'd both seen things. They'd both carried people who didn't make it. "Impressive work," Mercer said. It wasn't a question. "Thank you," Ashley replied. "For words." Her voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that came from not using it much. It was a difficult case. She moved past him toward the next patient, and she didn't see the way Mercer watched her go, or the way his expression shifted when she was out of sight. He stood in that hallway for another 30 seconds, processing something. Then he pulled out his phone. The rest of the shift moved in the familiar rhythm of night nursing. Vital signs. Medication reconciliation. One patient with chest pain who turned out to have anxiety. Another with a urinary tract infection that nobody had noticed during day shift. By 5:38 a.m., when the sun was thinking about rising but hadn't committed yet, Ashley had prevented 3 potential complications and caught a medication error from the afternoon team that could have been serious. Sterling watched her work. She was aware of his attention the way you become aware of a predator in tall grass, not because you see it, but because something primal recognizes the shift in the ecosystem. He was calculating something. Testing something. At 6:15 a.m., as the day shift began to arrive and the fluorescent light seemed to hum a little louder, Dr. Sterling approached her at the medication cart. "I'm impressed," he said. There was no warmth in the words. They were delivered like a threat wrapped in silk. "I didn't think you'd make it to morning. The bet's still open. I'm raising the stakes." Ashley closed the medication drawer and met his eyes. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to show she wasn't afraid, short enough to avoid escalation. "I'm clocking out, doctor," she said. Her voice carried the particular flatness of someone who'd spent years giving orders in places where inflection could cost lives. "The day shift is here." She walked past him, and as she moved, the jacket hanging on her shoulders shifted slightly. Inside the lining, against her ribs, the faded unit patch remained invisible. She'd left that world voluntarily, on a Tuesday in 2021, when the nightmares made her hands shake during routine procedures and she realized that staying would hurt more people than leaving. She'd told no one, not her sister in Atlanta, not her roommate, not the veteran services director who'd tried to help. She'd simply become Ashley Cooper, night shift nurse in Savannah, and let the woman in the patch disappear into the medical records and filed paperwork of a life she'd learned to pretend was someone else's. But Dr. Sterling had noticed something. And Mercer had seen deeper. She was driving home through the early morning light when her phone buzzed. A text from the hospital system, schedule updated. 7 p.m. start, Thursday. Dr. Sterling assigned as your preceptor for extended supervision period. Ashley stared at the message for 6 seconds, parked at a red light on Victory Drive. Then she set the phone down and continued driving. The red light turned green. The day began. And the only thing she could think was that Mercy had a shelf life, and hers was apparently expiring. The Mercy had a shelf life, and hers was apparently expiring fast. Ashley moved through the cafeteria at 11:56 p.m., tray balanced on her forearm like she'd done 1,000 times before, like the weight of it meant nothing. The night shift crowd was thin, 3 nurses from pediatrics, 2 orderlies restocking the vending machines, and Dr. Sterling, laughing too loud at a table near the beverage station with 2 residents who were learning real quick how to mirror his arrogance back at him. She didn't look at him. That was her mistake, maybe. Or maybe it was her presence that did it. Maybe the fact that she existed in the same room and hadn't quit yet was the thing that made his face darken like a storm rolling in off the Atlantic. Sterling stood. Just stood, no preamble, no warning. His cologne arrived before his body did, something expensive and aggressive, the kind of scent that announced itself whether anyone wanted to smell it or not. He moved directly into her path between the sandwich station and the tables. "You're blocking," Ashley started, her voice soft, deferential, the voice of someone who still believed politeness could dissolve tension. His shoulder struck her arm. Not an accident. Not the kind of thing that happened by mistake when someone was trying to move past each other in a narrow space. He hit her arm deliberately, and the tray, salad, turkey sandwich, a cup of coffee that had been steaming 5 seconds before, went airborne. The plate shattered. The coffee spread across the tile in a brown map of chaos. The sandwich landed face down like something already dead. The room went exactly as quiet as a held breath. Sterling turned to face the 2 residents. "See, this is the problem with hiring people who don't have the proper educational foundation. Hand-eye coordination suffers." He smiled at Ashley like she was a problem he'd just solved. "Maybe you should find something more suited to your skill set, Perhaps housekeeping is still hiring." One of the residents laughed. The other one studied his coffee with intense concentration. Ashley knelt. Started picking up shards of ceramic plate. Her movements were careful, precise, economical, not the panicked scrambling of someone who'd been humiliated. Just a woman cleaning up a mess. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical drone above her head. The orderlies had gone very still by the vending machines. Sterling didn't move. He stood watching her, waiting for something. Waiting for tears, probably. Waiting for her voice to crack or her hands to shake or for her to say something that would confirm his bet to the entire nursing staff that she'd be gone in 7 days. He stood there for 8 seconds, and when nothing happened, no cracking, no shaking, no desperate apologies, he turned and walked back to his table like a man who'd just disposed of trash. She was on her way back from the disposal with a damp paper towel when he intercepted her again. This time it was patient charts. A stack of them, held in his right hand, and he dropped them directly at her feet with a smile that could have powered a generator. "Pick that up, sweetheart." His voice was smooth as oil. Smooth as poison in honey. "File them in the right locations this time. Your organizational skills were, let's call them substandard yesterday." The charts scattered across the tile. At least 15 of them, maybe more, papers fanning out like birds that hadn't learned to fly yet. He waited, watching her with the expression of a man who was absolutely certain she would break. Ashley took one measured breath. Just one. She didn't move fast, didn't move frantically. She bent and began gathering the charts with her left hand while her right stayed steady, holding the paper towel. A tear formed, just one, just at the corner of her left eye, and she wiped it away without breaking eye contact. Without blinking. Without giving him anything except that single tear that proved she was human. That proved she felt it. Then she spoke. Her voice was low enough that only Sterling could hear it clearly, but the silence in the cafeteria was deep enough that it carried anyway, each word landing like precision-guided ordnance. "I've carried heavier things than your insecurity, Doctor." Sterling's face changed. The confidence flickered for just a moment, like a light switch that had been flipped by something he didn't expect. His jaw tightened. His hand clenched. He opened his mouth, and then he closed it again because the two residents were staring at him now, and even he understood that anything he said next would confirm what the entire cafeteria had just witnessed, that a night shift nurse he'd bet would fail had just obliterated him with 6 words and a steady gaze. He walked away. But this time his shoulders were rigid, and his movements weren't the easy stroll of a man who'd won. They were the tight, controlled movements of something hunting for a new strategy. Ashley finished gathering the charts. 43 seconds later, she was gone from the cafeteria, and the conversations resumed in the room like birds returning to a quiet branch. But something had shifted. One of the residents, the younger one, maybe 26, someone named Chen, watched her leave and thought about his own mother, who had served in the Army Reserve back in 2009. Chen noticed something in the way Ashley's shoulders were set. Something in the way her hands moved, too steady, too coordinated, like they'd been trained to do precise work under conditions he didn't want to imagine. He noticed but didn't say anything. Nobody said anything. Sterling had made it clear what happened to people who went against him in this hospital. Sterling had made it clear with one shoulder check and a drop tray and a chart pile and the institutional power that flowed through his phone and his board connections and his last name that had been on the hospital's founding documents for 3 generations. But what none of them understood yet was that you couldn't break what was already shattered. You couldn't humiliate someone who'd already lost everything and chosen to walk away from it. You couldn't trigger shame in a woman who'd learned long ago that shame was a luxury people with options could afford. Ashley worked the rest of her shift. Checked vitals on 14 patients. Documented 3 medication administrations. Assisted a resident with an arterial blood gas draw on a septic patient in ICU. At 3:22 a.m., her hand steady as surgical lasers, she was finishing a central line dressing change when the emergency department intercom exploded to life. Code Blue, Trauma 1. Multiple trauma incoming. ETA for minutes. The hospital lurched into motion. Emergency overhead pages crackled. Feet moved faster. The ER nurses scattered like startled fish. Ashley finished the dressing change, no rushing, no panic, just completion of the task, and headed toward the sound of chaos because that was what night shift nurses did. They moved toward the noise. The ambulance bays opened at 3:26 a.m., and what came through the doors looked like it had already been to hell and back. A motorcycle. A car. 2 riders, one conscious and screaming, one unconscious with a head wound that was bleeding in a way that meant his brain was probably swelling behind eyes that were already showing the first signs of herniation. Blood. The sharp copper smell of it, mixing with diesel exhaust and burned rubber. Dr. Sterling was in the trauma bay already, and Ashley watched his face shift the moment the stretcher came through. Watched it cycle from confidence to uncertainty in the space of 2 seconds. The unconscious patient's vitals were crashing. Blood pressure 72/40 and dropping, oxygen saturation already at 88%, heart rate climbing toward 160 like the chest was trying to escape from the body. Type and cross, for units, Sterling snapped, and someone moved. Get me 2 large bore 4s and start fluid resuscitation. But his hands were trembling. He reached for the patient's chest to perform the rapid assessment, and his fingers fumbled with the trauma shears. Fumbled. He'd been doing trauma surgery for 15 years, and his hands fumbled like they belonged to someone new, someone who'd only learned this choreography from a textbook instead of from bodies that were still breathing. The monitor showed what looked like cardiac tamponade. The heart was drowning in its own fluid. The pericardium had filled. The pressure was crushing the ventricles. We need pericardiocentesis, Ashley heard herself say. Heard the voice coming out as something different from the deferential nurse who'd picked up charts for hours ago. This voice was calm. Informed. The voice of someone who'd done this before and knew exactly what came next. Sterling didn't look at her. I've got it. But he didn't have it. His needle hand was the wrong angle. The entry site was off by centimeters. The ultrasound position was imprecise. Ashley watched from her position by the medication cabinet and felt something shift inside her chest. Felt muscle memory start moving like a door opening in a part of her mind she'd sealed shut 18 months ago. He pushed the needle. Missed. Pulled back. Repositioned. Missed again. The heart rate jumped to 168. The oxygen saturation dropped to 78. Step back, Ashley said. Sterling turned to her, his face already reddening. Excuse me. You're going to kill him. Step back. The room went absolutely silent. No one moved. No one breathed. Sterling's face cycled through anger, then something darker, the realization that in front of 6 witnesses, he'd just been challenged. But the patient's blood pressure was now 60/30, and the ceiling had changed. The hierarchy that had kept everything in order 2 minutes ago didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that a 4-minute window for a successful needle insertion was collapsing into a 3-minute window, and then a 2-minute window, and then there would be no window at all. Ashley moved. Her hands took the needle. Her fingers found the anatomical landmarks, second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the exact coordinates she'd learned in training that she'd buried deeper than memories usually go. The ultrasound showed the fluid collection. The pressure around the heart. The drowning that was silent and fast. 18 seconds. That was all it took. The needle in. The syringe attached. The pull back. 120 milliliters of blood came free, and the patient's oxygen saturation climbed from 78 to 84 to 91. The heart rate dropped from 168 down toward 110. The blood pressure found solid ground at 104/62. Sinus rhythm. A steady, normal, beautiful sinus rhythm on the monitor. The room was so quiet you could hear the ventilator wheeze. Sterling stared at the monitor. At her. Back at the monitor. His mouth opened and closed like something learning how to work. Around them, the trauma residents were staring too. Not at the patient. At Ashley. And that was when the doors burst open again, and everything that came next changed the architecture of every life in Oak Creek Memorial forever. The ambulance bay doors burst open at 2:19 a.m., and the paramedics were already calling vitals before the stretcher hit the tile. Blood pressure 68/40 and falling. Heart rate 142, dysrhythmic. The motorcycle had lost the argument with a delivery truck on Victory Drive, and the Navy officer on that stretcher had lost the coin flip with physics. His chest cavity was filling with blood that had nowhere to go. Trauma Bay 3, the charge nurse called, and the team scattered like practiced dancers toward their marks. Dr. Sterling was already there, summoned by the automated alert that screamed through the hospital's nervous system. He stood at the head of the bed with his hands at his sides, watching the paramedics transfer the patient with the detached expression of a man reviewing a museum exhibit. Ashley was 3 steps behind, moving into position with the mechanical precision that made night shift nursing look like assembly line work. She'd seen Sterling hesitate before. She'd watched him consult, delegate, defer. But this hesitation was different. This was the hesitation of a man whose credentials had never matched his competence, and he was finally standing in a room where it mattered. The monitor beeped its accelerating rhythm. Oxygen saturation 78 and dropping. The paramedic summary came rapid fire: crushed left thorax, massive internal bleeding, we couldn't get an 4 line, no response to positioning. Get me 2 large bore lines, Sterling said. His voice had the shape of authority, but it sounded like he was reading from a script. Type and cross for emergency release. He needs a pericardiocentesis, Ashley said. Not a question. Not a request. Sterling's eyes found hers across the patient's body. We'll assess when we have imaging. He doesn't have time for imaging. The monitor had already decided. The blips were coming slower now, the spaces between them stretching like shadows. O2 sat dropped to 74. Cardiac tamponade. His heart's being crushed by its own blood. I said we'll assess. The patient's eyes rolled back. The monitor's rhythm fragmented into something that didn't spell survival. The room's air pressure changed, not a metaphor but a real shift, the way a building feels different when the power dies. Ashley moved without waiting for permission. She reached for the crash cart, her hands already knowing where everything lived. 14-gauge needle. A bottle of chlorhexidine. The surgical site, second intercostal space, midclavicular line, a spot on the human body that was the width of a finger from the pericardium. Sterling watched her prepare. His mouth was moving but no words came out. He'd trained for this scenario exactly as many times as everyone else who'd gone to his medical school and coasted through internship on his father's hospital board connections. Which is to say, not at all. Not in any way that mattered. Ashley's hands moved steady as a surgical laser. She felt the moment the needle found the space between ribs, a sensation that lived in her muscle memory from a field hospital in Sangin where a mortar round had collapsed the roof 2 feet from where she was working, and she'd kept her hands moving anyway because the alternative was 17 men dying in the dust and blood. The needle advanced. The syringe was already ready in her free hand because her hand knew what came next without consulting her brain. The first draw was dark blood. Not arterial. Not from the heart chambers themselves but the space surrounding them. The pericardial sac, that membrane that held the heart like water holds a stone. The blood was drowning him from the inside. She drew it out. 2 milliliters. 5. 10. The negative pressure released like a held breath. The monitor's rhythm stuttered. Then steadied. Oxygen saturation 75. Then 78. Then 82. The numbers climbed like a ladder out of the dark. 85, 88. 92, stable. The patient's eyes opened. His hand reached out, and his fingers found Ashley's wrist. His voice was like something being dragged through gravel, but the word came clear: nomad. The room went dead silent. Sterling had already backed away, creating distance between himself and the procedure like the patient's survival was something contagious he didn't want to catch. The trauma nurses stood motionless, their eyes moving between the patient's hand on Ashley's arm and the monitor finally showing something resembling a human heartbeat. One of them was a combat medic. His name was Halstead, and he'd served with the 75th Ranger Regiment before his knees gave out and he'd traded combat boots for scrubs. He was staring at the angle of Ashley's hands, the way her shoulders had dropped exactly 2 inches when the pressure released, the surgical economy of movement that didn't come from a civilian nursing program. The patient's eyes closed again, but his grip on Ashley's wrist didn't loosen. His lips moved without sound. Again, nomad. "Get me central line supplies," Ashley said to no one in particular. Her voice had dropped an octave. It came out like a command, not a request. "We need fluid resuscitation. Type O negative, push it fast. I need an EKG and a chest X-ray stat, and someone get cardiothoracics on the phone because this man's pericardium just bought us time but not forever." The nurses moved. They'd have moved for Sterling on a good day, but they moved for Ashley like her words had the weight of something that couldn't be disobeyed. Halstead was already running toward the supply room, his prosthetic leg making him favor his left side, but his hands were moving with the same purpose they'd had when he was younger, and the stakes were higher, and there was no one to call except the medic who could make bad into survivable with just what she had in her pack. Sterling turned and walked out. Ashley heard his shoes clicking on the tile as he moved toward the hallway, the sound sharp and quick like he was trying to leave something behind. She stayed. Her hands kept moving. The central line went in with the same precision as the pericardiocentesis, a tunnel into the subclavian vein, the needle threading through the skin and muscle and fascia with the kind of accuracy that you only learned when you'd done it 100 times with no anesthesia and mortar fire painting the sky overhead. The 4 pushed wide open, fluids running hot into the patient's veins to replace what the road and gravity had taken. Halstead came back carrying supplies, and he didn't say anything, but his eyes told her he knew. He'd seen hands like hers before. He'd served with hands like hers. He knew what a field hospital really looked like when it was just one person against the clock and physics and the very simple fact that certain men had decided they weren't ready to die yet. The monitor kept its rhythm. O2 sat holding at 91, steady as a promise. The patient's color was coming back, not alive exactly, but not dying anymore, which in the first minutes after the worst part of a trauma is the same thing as resurrection. And that was when the phone rang in Dr. Sterling's office, and a 4-star admiral picked it up and told the voice on the other end that his son had been in an accident, and that same voice, the charge nurse from Oak Creek Memorial, told him that his son was alive because a night shift nurse had saved him, and the admiral asked her name, and when she told him, he said one quiet word that started everything that was coming next: nomad. The admiral's voice on that line was ice water. Calm. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. When the charge nurse told him his son was alive, that a night shift nurse had saved him, his breathing didn't change. He asked one question, her name. And when he heard it, he said nothing for 3 seconds. Then, nomad. One word. That was all. He hung up the phone and made 3 calls before his feet touched the ground, not to lawyers, not to family, but to people who answered phones at 2:36 a.m. without asking who was calling. Dr. Sterling's hands were still shaking when he got back to his office. The waiting room had gone silent when that officer's vitals stabilized. Sinus rhythm. The monitor confirmed it. The room held its breath like it was waiting for permission to exhale, and for just a moment, Sterling had felt something crack inside his chest. Then his survival instinct kicked in. It always did. He sat at his mahogany desk, the one that cost more than most nurses made in a year, and he picked up the phone. The hospital board president was on hole 7 at Burning Ridge Golf Club. Sterling could hear the ocean in the background. He didn't apologize for the interruption. "We have a problem," Sterling said. "A protocol violation. Potentially serious. Night shift RN named Ashley Cooper. Suspended pending investigation. I'm documenting everything." The board president's voice came back easy, unconcerned. They knew each other. They'd known each other for 18 years, since Sterling's father-in-law had donated the cardiovascular wing. "Handle it," the president said. "Whatever you need." Sterling hung up and dialed the main number for Mercy General in Atlanta, where the personnel record showed Ashley had worked 3 years ago. He used a different name this time. Just an HR inquiry. Routine reference check. But he asked the right questions: any disciplinary issues, gaps in performance, reasons for departure, details about her shift assignments, anything unusual noted by her colleagues. The voice on the other end paused. "Too long. I'm not at liberty to discuss details," the woman said. But Sterling heard it in a hesitation. There was something. Something they wouldn't put in writing, but everyone remembered. He didn't push. He didn't need to. He simply said, "Thank you," and hung up. Then he called a name that made his network expand into territory he'd never needed before, an outside performance auditor based in Atlanta, the kind of consultant hospitals brought in when they needed documentation that would hold up in court. $2,000 a day. Sterling authorized it without blinking. The auditor's job was simple: shadow the night shift. Document every protocol deviation, every moment Ashley's procedure wasn't by the textbook, every second she spent outside her scope of practice. Build a case. Make it airtight. By 6:11 a.m., security had already pulled her into the administrative office. Ashley didn't resist. She never did. That was the problem with her, Sterling thought. She didn't give him anything to work with. No temper, no breakdown, no moment where she lost control and gave him justification for what was already decided. The badge was deactivated in front of her, the electronic access to the hospital cancelled in real time. She could watch it happen. That was intentional. The suspension notice was printed on hospital letterhead, dated and signed by 3 department heads, all of them allies of Sterling. The charge nurse held a cardboard box. This was the part that made Sterling's pulse quicken. Clearing out a locker. Public removal. Day shift was already arriving, and they would see her walk out with her belongings in a box. Ashley opened her locker in the staff room at 7:13 a.m. The fluorescent lights were harsh. Everything about this moment was designed to be harsh. A security officer stood 3 feet away, watching, making sure she didn't take anything that wasn't hers. The other nurses pretended not to look, but they were looking. She could feel their eyes like weight. There wasn't much in there: a spare pair of scrubs, a water bottle, an extra jacket. And there, on the bottom shelf, beneath everything else, the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining of her jacket. Sangin. She held it for just a moment, the fabric thin between her fingers, the stitching coming loose at one corner. Her hands didn't shake. That was what she'd trained them never to do. She folded the jacket slowly and placed it in the box. The walkout took exactly 43 seconds. She counted them. Counted the tiles under her feet. Counted the breaths she took, controlled, measured, the way you breathe when you're disarming ordnance, and the whole thing could explode if you make one mistake. Her face was neutral. That was discipline. That was the wall she'd built 18 months ago when she decided to become nobody. She'd been somebody once, and it had cost her everything. Better to be invisible. Better to be just a nurse. Better to be forgotten. She pushed through the doors into the Savannah morning, and the box was still light in her hands, and nobody called after her. 3 days later, she was sitting in the VA hospital waiting room at 10:22 a.m. on a Tuesday. The room smelled like coffee that had been reheated too many times, and the kind of silence that only exists where people are suffering quietly. The walls were beige. Everything was beige. There was a wall-mounted television showing the news with no sound. She was wearing jeans and a hoodie, and her hair was down instead of pulled back, and to anyone passing by, she looked like just another person there for an appointment. Except she wasn't a patient. Not officially. She was here to schedule a first session with the trauma psychiatrist. The intake form asked about service, and she checked the box marked Navy, and she wrote the years, and she wrote nothing about the location, nothing about what happened, nothing about why her hand sometimes shook when she was tired. Around her, men and women in various states of recovery were waiting. She recognized some of them. Not from names. From procedures. From nights when she'd held their hands in field hospitals that were never meant to be permanent, in spaces that shouldn't exist because they indicated failure of an earlier system. She'd treated a sergeant in Fallujah with a compound fracture who was now reading a paperback western with his left arm supported by a sling. She'd stitched up a Marine from Helmand Province who was now staring at a television screen with the kind of 1,000-yard stare that meant he wasn't seeing anything at all. They didn't recognize her. Her face was different when she wasn't in scrubs. When she wasn't saving lives. When she was just another broken veteran waiting for help. She sat in that chair, plastic, grey, uncomfortable, and she felt the weight of everything pressing down like an actual physical thing. The job was gone. Her housing was month to month, and she didn't have enough in her bank account for more than 6 weeks. Her sister hadn't heard from her in 4 months, and the last time they'd talked, Ashley had said she was fine, and her sister knew she was lying, but she also knew better than to push. Her apartment was quiet. Her days were empty. She'd walked away from the Navy to find peace, and instead she'd found exhaustion masquerading as survival. The irony was that she'd run from the uniforms and the hierarchy and the weight of command, and then she'd become a nurse, which was the same thing in a different color. She'd still been following orders. She'd still been responsible for lives. She'd still been carrying the weight of people depending on her being perfect, being strong, being unbreakable. She held her paperwork and thought about not coming back. She thought about driving out of Savannah in the next 6 hours and finding some other city where nobody knew her name. Phoenix. Or Portland. Or somewhere in Montana where the mountains were high enough that they couldn't follow. She'd done it before. She could do it again. Each time was easier because each time she had less to leave behind. First time it was the uniform. Second time it was the relationships. Third time it was the apartment. Eventually there would be nothing left but the woman, and even she was negotiable. Even she was just a collection of survival mechanisms that had overstayed their welcome. The intake nurse called her name, the civilian name, the false name, the name she'd built 18 months ago in a hospital in Savannah where everything was supposed to be different. Ashley Cooper. She stood. She walked. That was something. That was still functioning. They took her blood pressure, and it was elevated, and the nurse asked if she was nervous, and Ashley said, no. Which was true in the way that ice is still ice even when it's melting. The psychiatrist would see her in 2 weeks. 2 weeks of waiting. 2 weeks of days that were all the same color. She could survive 2 weeks. She'd survived worse. That was what she kept telling herself, and each time it sounded like less of a truth and more like a question. She left the VA hospital at 11:38 a.m. The sun was bright. The parking lot was empty except for scattered cars. She got into hers, a 2014 Honda Civic with a check engine light that had been on for 6 months, and she sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. Her hands on the steering wheel. Her jacket on the passenger seat, the patch visible through the worn fabric of the lining. She could throw it away. She could burn it. She could make the final break and become someone new, someone who'd never served, someone who had no history, no weight, no past that would haunt her into VA waiting rooms at 11 in the morning on days that felt the same as every other day. She reached for the jacket. Picked it up. Held the faded patch between her fingers, and the stitching was already coming loose, and it would take nothing to just tear it the rest of the way and let it scatter into the parking lot where it belonged. Nothing to do it. Everything to do it. She sat there with the patch in her hand, and her eyes burned, but soldiers don't cry, and nurses don't break down in parking lots, and Ashley Cooper didn't exist anymore anyway, so what did it matter if she cried or broke or disappeared entirely? And then she heard it. Distant at first. A low thrum that didn't belong to any civilian aircraft. The sound got closer, and she recognized the rhythm of military helicopter rotors cutting the air at high velocity. Not one. Multiple. She looked up through the windshield, and there 3 Black Hawks approaching from the northeast, moving in formation, the rotor wash creating a pressure change that made her car rock on its suspension. They were heading toward the city. Toward the hospital. Toward Oak Creek Memorial. The helicopters descended on Oak Creek Memorial at 4:36 a.m., rotors hammering the pre-dawn silence into submission. Their shadows swept across the parking lot like searchlights from a courtroom. A 4-star Navy admiral stepped out before the wheels touched concrete, his uniform pressed so sharply it could cut skin, his face carrying the particular gravity of a man who had sent others to die and lived with that arithmetic every single day. Behind him came 3 officers in dress blues and a SEAL team leader whose call sign was Breaker, whose presence made the air pressure change in ways that had nothing to do with the helicopter blades still spinning. They moved through the hospital corridors with the kind of purposeful silence that made nurses step sideways into door frames. No one asked them where they were going. No one needed to. Authority this absolute doesn't announce itself. It walks in and the building reorganizes itself around it. The admiral pushed into the ICU room where the Navy officer lay intubated, machines keeping time with his recovering heart. The man's eyes opened the moment his father entered. Machines beeped their steady rhythm. The father placed one hand on his son's shoulder and held it there, the kind of touch that doesn't need words because it carries all of them at once. Then the young officer's eyes shifted. Found Ashley standing in the corner where she'd been standing for 6 hours straight, watching his numbers climb, watching the danger recede degree by degree. His hand lifted maybe 2 inches off the bed. His eyes locked directly onto hers. His voice, rough from the breathing tube they'd extubated 8 hours earlier, pushed out a single word like it was the only word he'd ever needed to speak: nomad. The room didn't go silent. Silence would have been quieter. This was the sound of physics stopping, of assumptions reversing, of 9 people suddenly understanding that everything they thought they understood was wrong. The admiral's head turned. His eyes found Ashley's face. His expression didn't change. Military men learn to let nothing show on their faces because showing something is a weakness, but something did show: recognition. The kind of recognition that only comes when you see someone you've been looking for in a place you never thought to search. He walked directly toward her. No hesitation. No question. Just movement, the kind of movement a man gives an order to. Senior Chief Petty Officer, he said. Not Ashley. Not nurse. Not the hesitant woman everyone in this hospital had learned to dismiss. Her rank. Spoken aloud. The word sat in the air like a detonation charge waiting for impact. A floor nurse standing near the monitors made a sound, half gasp, half prayer. Her hand shook as she pulled the file from the cabinet. Ashley had never seen a medical record make someone tremble before. The nurse's voice fragmented as she read, Bronze Star. Bronze Star. Navy Cross. Each medal a sentence. Each sentence a lie she'd been living. The room was full of people. It was full of machines. But in that moment it felt like there were only 5 of them in the entire building, the Admiral, the young officer, Ashley, and 2 more who hadn't moved yet. Then Breaker stepped forward. The SEAL team leader moved into the center of the room with the terrifying fluid precision of apex predators, and when he spoke his voice carried the weight of classified operations and nights that didn't appear in any official record. Bronze Star for extraction under fire, Bastion Forward Operating Base, Kandahar Province. He paused. Let it land. Bronze Star for coordinated field medicine during the Loga Valley Offensive, 3 simultaneous casualty sites. She worked 72 hours without rest. Another pause. His eyes were on Ashley now, not looking away. Not once breaking eye contact. Navy Cross. Sangin Valley, 2019. She held a field hospital alone. 6 hours. Direct fire. 17 incoming rounds on the structure. She never left position. 14 soldiers under her hands. 14 who made it home because she chose to stay when staying meant dying. The Admiral's hand came up. He was already on his phone. Speaking in the kind of low, controlled voice that makes careers end. I need the hospital board chairman. Now. This is Admiral James Richardson, United States Navy. Yes, I'll hold. A beat. Then, you have 30 seconds to explain why Senior Chief Petty Officer Cooper is suspended pending investigation rather than running your trauma department. Go. Boots on tile. That was the first sound to break through the stunned air. Dr. Sterling's footsteps coming down the hallway, quick and confident, responding to what he thought was a routine consultation call from the Admiral's office. His face was already wearing that easy smile, that casual arrogance that had been his armor for so long. He pushed through the ICU room door. The smile froze on his face. The Admiral was still on the phone. The room was full of Navy uniforms. Breaker was standing with his arms crossed. And Ashley, the quiet night shift nurse he'd spent 2 weeks trying to break, was standing in the center of the space like she'd always belonged there. Dr. Sterling, the Admiral said, not looking away from Ashley. You're terminated. Effective immediately. Gather your personal items and meet me in the main lobby in 15 minutes. We're going to discuss your termination process in front of the local news crews who are currently rolling into the parking lot. Sterling's face went white. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. The Admiral had already hung up the phone. The room was moving around him and he was standing absolutely still. It took 10 minutes. Sterling had a small photograph on his desk, something with his family, something with his name on a plaque, the detritus of a life built on leverage and pressure. He gathered it all in his hands like it was going to burn him if he held it too long. His walk down the hallway was different now. Slower. Like his legs weren't quite receiving the messages his brain was trying to send. The main lobby had the terrible brightness of institutional lighting and the worse clarity of live news cameras. 11 staff members had found reasons to be there. 8 had not. 3 were recording on their phones. The Admiral stood at the entrance with the hospital board chairman on one side and 2 NCIS agents on the other, their badges catching the fluorescent lights like warnings. Sterling's mouth kept opening and closing. No words. Just the terrible silence of a man watching his entire architecture collapse in real time. One of the NCIS agents was reading something off his phone. Harassment charges. Retaliation. fabricated performance violations, unauthorized contact with previous employers. The charges kept coming like an inventory of every choice he'd ever made. They led him out past the nurse's station, past the staff break room, past every person who had watched him knock a tray from Ashley's hands, every witness to the charts he'd thrown at her feet. Their eyes followed him. None of them looked away. None of them had mercy in their faces. 3 months later, the hospital announced a new veteran trauma program. An entire wing dedicated to combat-related injuries, staffed by people who understood what it meant to carry wounds that didn't show on X-rays. A naval corpsman who'd survived 3 IED explosions. A trauma surgeon who'd worked in FOB showrunner. An anesthesiologist whose PTSD had nearly cost her everything. And heading it all was the senior chief petty officer with the Navy Cross, the faded unit patch from Sangin framed on her office wall in a position where the light hit it directly every morning at sunrise. But she wasn't in the office when the Admiral visited. She was in Trauma Bay 2, hands moving through a secondary survey on an 18-year-old motorcycle accident victim, her voice soft and precise, giving orders that everyone in the room responded to without hesitation. The Admiral watched from the doorway for 90 seconds, then left without speaking. Some recognitions don't need words. Months passed. News cycles turned. The hospital board issued a public apology to Ashley and established mandatory ethics training for all surgical staff. They hired 2 additional nurses specifically for the veteran program. They installed better lighting in every trauma bay and updated the protocols for patient confidentiality. Dr. Sterling took a job at an urgent care clinic in Tucson. The name tag read Steve. He sold supplemental insurance from a folding table outside a strip mall on weekends, the kind of work where your past doesn't matter because no one cares who you are. He flinched when anyone called him doctor. His hands shook sometimes when he held a clipboard. The particular gravity of consequence had finally caught up with him, and it wore his face like a custom-made suit. Ashley sat in her office late on a Friday afternoon, the patch from Sangin catching the low gold light, and pulled up the incident report one final time. All of it was documented. The harassment, the fabricated charges, the unauthorized network of contacts. The NCIS investigation was already complete. Sterling's medical license would be under review for 2 years. The retaliation case would likely settle out of court. Justice moved slowly, but it moved. She closed the file. She did not feel victorious. She felt something quieter, the particular exhaustion that comes from holding your own story private for so long that speaking it aloud almost doesn't feel real. But below that was something else. A small, solid thing. Proof that you can choose to step back into the light without burning. That the scars have a story worth telling. That sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding it all together, and sometimes being seen for that isn't weakness. It's recognition. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the knowledge that she could have ended this a dozen different ways, and instead she chose the way that made her live. She chose to heal. She chose to come back. And now, every veteran who came through the trauma program would know that someone who'd stood where they were standing had built this place for them. Had held the line when the line was collapsing. Had survived the thing that was supposed to destroy her. She pulled on her scrubs. She clipped her badge back to her collar. She walked down the hallway toward Trauma Bay 3 where a patient was waiting, where hands were needed, where the work continued in that particular quiet that comes after storms. The fluorescent lights hummed their steady frequency. Somewhere in the building, a monitor beeped. Somewhere in the building, someone's heartbeat was climbing back from the edge, and all that mattered was being present for it. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark. If you've ever carried a secret that cost you everything, or if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your strength, tell us your story in the comments. And if you believe veteran trauma survivors deserve better support, better resources, and better recognition in our medical system, like this video and subscribe for more stories about the people fighting battles we never see.